The room was silent, except for the ticking of an old brass clock on the wall, each sound echoing through the paneled office like a gavel. I sat stiffly in the leather chair, my hands folded tightly in my lap, though they trembled despite every ounce of control I tried to summon. At 62, I had seen my share of humiliation, but I never imagined my own son would deal me the cruelest blow of my life. Across the table, my son Marcus Brooks, 34 years old, stood tall in a tailored navy suit, his voice slicing through the silence with arrogance and venom. "Mom," he said loudly enough for the entire room of relatives to hear. "Stop pretending. You're getting nothing from Dad's $34 million estate." His words cracked like a whip, and several cousins stifled smirks while an aunt shook her head with thinly veiled pity. The word nothing, sharp and merciless, hung in the air like smoke after a fire searing itself into my chest. I felt a wave of heat flood my face as though every eye in that office, every dismissive glance, every whispered judgment was a weight pressing down on me. They had always looked at me as the woman who had been left behind, the wife discarded for ambition, the mother whose own child turned away. Now Marcus was making sure I knew my place. I swallowed hard, refusing to let tears blur my vision. For years, I had lived modestly, quietly, and with dignity. But Marcus's cruelty was designed to strip me of that last defense. He leaned back in his chair, lips curled in a smug smile, radiating the entitlement that had poisoned him since the divorce tore our family apart. He thought he had already won. I glanced toward the end of the long mahogany table where Howard Green, the attorney, adjusted his glasses. The man was steady, his expression unreadable, yet there was the faintest flicker at the corner of his mouth, a smile restrained, deliberate. He tapped the thick envelope against the polished wood, then looked directly at me as if to say, "Wait!" My heart pounded. Every muscle in my body urged me to stand, to shout, to demand recognition, but my voice caught in my throat. I thought of the decades I had given the sacrifices buried beneath the shadow of Charles Brooks's empire, and how Marcus, my only child, had chosen power over love. The betrayal was not new, but in that moment it was absolute. Around us, the room buzzed faintly with restrained curiosity. A cousin whispered, "Nothing? Did she really get cut out?" Another muttered, "Of course she never mattered to him." Their words stung, but I forced myself to sit straighter. I would not crumble in front of them. "Not again!" Marcus, emboldened, chuckled. "Face it, Mom. Dad knew you were useless. Everything belongs to me now." His arrogance filled the air, choking, suffocating. I felt the sting of his rejection not just as a mother, but as a woman who had given everything and received only disdain in return. Yet just as despair threatened to crush me, Howard Green cleared his throat. The sound was sharp, commanding, and it silenced the whispers instantly. All eyes turned to him. He unfolded the envelope with deliberate precision, sliding out the official pages of Charles Brooks's last will and testament. He glanced at Marcus, then at me, and for the first time his faint smile broadened into something undeniable. "Let's see," he said calmly, his voice steady but laced with something that sounded almost like amusement. "There's more here than you realize." My pulse quickened. Marcus froze, his smirk faltering, uncertainty creeping into his eyes. The clock ticked once more, louder than before, as if marking the beginning of a reckoning none of them expected. Before I tell you how that day truly unfolded, I need to pause and speak directly to you. Stories like mine are not just tales of money or betrayal. They are about family dignity and justice, themes that touch so many lives. If you are listening right now, I want to invite you to join me on this journey. Please take a moment to subscribe, because there are countless stories where the truth hides behind silence until one day it erupts into the open. And while you are here, I would love for you to share something personal with me. Tell me where you are watching from, your city, your state. I have found so much comfort knowing that people across America, from small towns to busy cities, are part of this community. Your presence reminds me that even when we feel abandoned, we are never truly alone. Together, our voices carry further than we imagine. I live a quiet life these days, tucked away in a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of Atlanta, Georgia. The building itself is nothing special, brick walls faded by decades of sun, the smell of fried chicken from a neighbor's kitchen drifting through the hallways, the steady hum of an old air conditioning unit that rattles at night. My apartment is small, but it is mine. I keep it tidy, though the carpet is worn thin and the wallpaper peels near the corners. On cold mornings, I wrap myself in my old red coat, a relic from another lifetime, and sip instant coffee from a chipped mug. My car, a 20-year-old Honda Civic, rests in the parking lot like a loyal friend. Its paint has dulled, and the heater only works when it feels like it, but it takes me where I need to go. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I drive across town to the community library where I volunteer. I shelve books, help children find picture stories, and sometimes sit with older men and women who come for nothing more than company. That library is my sanctuary, a place where I am not judged by my past, but valued for my presence. My closest friend, Loretta Johnson, lives just 2 doors down. At 70, Loretta moves slower than she used to, but her laughter carries the strength of a woman who has weathered storms. On Saturday mornings, she knocks on my door, holding a pot of strong coffee, and we sit at my kitchen table talking about everything from the rising grocery prices to the old songs we grew up with. She knows bits of my story enough to understand why I sometimes stare out the window longer than I should. "You gave too much of yourself, Evelyn," she tells me often, but the world has a way of circling back. Justice comes even if it's late. I want to believe her, but life has taught me otherwise. The truth is, I learned long ago not to expect much. After the divorce, I settled into this small corner of the world, trading the noise of grand houses and country clubs for coupon clipping and discount stores. I became invisible, and for a while invisibility felt like safety. Yet deep inside, there remained a quiet ache. I had been more than just a wife left behind. I had been the woman who worked double shifts to keep food on the table when Charles was starting his business. The woman who stayed awake with Marcus through fevers and nightmares. The woman who folded herself smaller and smaller so others could stand taller. Those sacrifices became invisible to everyone but me. Sometimes when the apartment grew too silent, I would open the closet and run my hands over that old red coat. The fabric is thinning now, but every stitch carries a memory the winters when I couldn't afford a new one, the days I walked Marcus to school, holding his small hand, the nights I returned home exhausted but still managed to cook dinner. That coat was a symbol of endurance, of love that asked for nothing in return. I told myself I had made peace with the life I now lived, that my small routines were enough. Grocery store on Mondays, church on Sundays, library twice a week, coffee with Loretta when we could. I thought I had accepted that the grand chapters of my life were finished, that what remained was only quiet epilogue. But peace is fragile. It can be shattered with a single phone call, a single voice on the other end of the line. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the pines and painted the apartment walls in shades of gold, my phone rang. I stared at it for a moment, feeling an unease I couldn't name. When I lifted it to my ear, the words that spilled through changed everything. The voice on the other end was cold, clipped, and efficient. "Mrs. Brooks, I regret to inform you that Charles passed away last night. A stroke. It was sudden. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Though my marriage to Charles had ended more than a decade ago, the name still carried weight in my chest. Memories of our early years, of the young man who had once held my hand and promised forever, came rushing back. I steadied myself against the counter, staring at the worn linoleum floor as if it could anchor me. The caller continued, "The funeral will be held this Saturday at Riverside Chapel. Following that, there will be a reading of the will next week at Mr. Howard Green's office. You will receive the formal details by mail." My lips trembled as I muttered a quiet thank you, though the line had already gone silent. I lowered the phone slowly as though it had grown heavier and sank into the nearest chair. My heart thudded a rhythm of confusion and dread. Charles was gone. Whatever bitterness lingered between us, whatever wounds had never healed, death had closed that chapter forever. Yet the ache in my chest was not grief alone. It was fear of what came next. Later that evening, my phone rang again. This time, the caller ID flashed a name that twisted the knot in my stomach: Marcus. I hesitated, then answered. His voice was sharp, almost mocking. "Mom, don't get your hopes up. I just wanted to be clear with you before the funeral circus begins. You're not in Dad's will. Everything goes to me. That's how he wanted it." My throat went dry. "Marcus." I whispered. Why would you say that before anything has even been read? He chuckled, the sound hollow cruel. Because I know, and because you should hear it from me, not from the lawyer when he confirms it. Don't embarrass yourself expecting something you don't deserve. The line clicked dead. I stared at the silent phone, his words burning in my ears. My son, my own flesh and blood. I had carried him, raised him, sacrificed everything for him, and now he wielded cruelty as though it were his inheritance already. I pressed the phone to my chest as if I could still pull some warmth from the device, but there was none. Only the cold certainty that I was walking into a storm with no shelter. The funeral loomed ahead, and after that the reading of the will. I could already feel the eyes of family and community sharpening, waiting to see me humiliated once more. For the first time in years, my red coat felt like armor. I hung it over the chair, staring at it in the dim light, and whispered to myself, "Stand tall, Evelyn. Stand tall." When I close my eyes and force myself to remember the beginning, I see a different world, one painted in the warm glow of possibility. It was 1981, and I was a 20-year-old woman with ambition burning in my chest. Atlanta was alive in those days. Soul music spilling from record shops, the scent of barbecue rising from street corners, and the hum of opportunity vibrating through every crowded sidewalk. That was when I met Charles Brooks. He was 24, then tall and confident, with a laugh that seemed to part every crowd. I met him at a church fundraiser of all places. I was helping in the kitchen serving plates of fried catfish and cornbread when he stepped in with a donation check larger than any I had ever seen. His eyes lingered on me as I handed him his plate. "You've got the kind of smile that makes a man think the world is kinder than it is," he said. My cheeks flushed, and for the first time I let myself believe I might be worthy of such attention. Charles was ambitious, already dreaming bigger than the rest of us dared. He spoke of opening businesses, of building an empire that would leave his name etched into the city itself. I laughed at his grand ideas, then thinking them impossible, but his certainty was magnetic. Within months, he was taking me on long drives in his old Buick, pointing at storefronts and declaring, "One day, Evelyn, that'll have my name on it." I fell in love with his vision perhaps more than with the man himself. We married in the spring of 1983. It was a modest ceremony in the same church where we'd first met. I wore a borrowed dress lace yellowing at the seams, but Charles looked at me like I was royalty. We had nothing, just a rented apartment and a dream that seemed far too big for our small hands. But we built anyway. I worked 2 jobs waitressing at night and bookkeeping during the day, while Charles poured every waking hour into his first venture, a small logistics company that he insisted would one day rival the giants. The early years were hard, unbearably so. There were nights when we had nothing but beans and rice, and mornings when the power company threatened to cut us off. Still, I believed. I believed so fiercely in him, in us, that I ignored the exhaustion etched into my bones. When Marcus was born in 1989, I thought my sacrifices had finally found their purpose. I held that baby boy against my chest, his tiny fingers gripping mine, and whispered promises of a brighter future. But as the years passed, Charles's ambition began to outgrow the walls of our marriage. Success came slowly then, all at once. By the mid-1990s, his company had contracts across the Southeast, and suddenly, we were living in a house with a manicured lawn, granite countertops, and cars I was afraid to scratch. Charles thrived in that world of suits and boardrooms, and he began to carry himself like a man, untouchable. The more he gained, the less he seemed to see me. I still wore my red coat on cold mornings, still clipped coupons, still carried the lessons my mother taught me about humility, but Charles began to look at me with disappointment, as though my simplicity was a flaw to be corrected. He took Marcus to country clubs and corporate dinners, dressed him in tailored suits before he was even a teenager, teaching him the language of wealth. I remained at home, the invisible scaffolding, holding up the empire, but never acknowledged. The cracks in our marriage deepened with every year. He worked later, traveled more, and when he was home, his words were sharp. "Evelyn," he once snapped, "you're holding Marcus back. He needs to see the world, not coupons and casseroles." I swallowed my hurt, telling myself it was temporary, that the man I loved was still there beneath the armor of ambition. By the time Marcus entered high school, Charles was no longer the husband I had married. He was a figurehead celebrated in business journals, envied by neighbors, admired by strangers, and Marcus adored him. My son, the boy I had rocked to sleep, began to mirror his father's dismissive tone. When he turned 16, he scoffed at the dinner I placed before him. "Dad takes me to steakhouses. Why can't you cook something decent?" His words pierced me deeper than any insult Charles had ever thrown. The divorce came in 2010 when I was 50. I discovered Charles had been unfaithful for years, though by then love had long since withered into duty. He filed the papers swiftly, efficiently, and I signed them with trembling hands. The settlement was meager. I walked away with little more than my car, my clothes, and the red coat I refused to let go. Marcus chose to stay with his father, and though I told him I understood the truth, it shattered me. He stopped visiting, stopped calling, until one day he looked at me not as his mother, but as a relic of a life he was ashamed of. In the years since I built a quieter existence, no more country clubs, no more lavish parties. Just the rhythm of survival, paying rent, volunteering at the library, sharing coffee with Loretta. But every so often I'd see Charles on the news, his company signing multi-million-dollar deals, his smile plastered across glossy magazines. And beside him, Marcus, tall and proud, the perfect heir to a kingdom I had helped build, but was never allowed to claim. What stung the most was not the money I had lost, but the recognition. No one remembered the nights I stayed awake balancing ledgers, the double shifts I endured, so Charles could chase contracts, the meals I skipped, so Marcus could eat. My sacrifices had been erased from the story, leaving me as nothing more than a footnote. And yet, despite everything, a part of me had always hoped that Marcus would remember the mother who had loved him fiercely. Hoped that Charles, beneath his arrogance, might one day acknowledge what I gave. But hope is a fragile thing. It flickers like a candle in the wind, and more often than not, it burns out in silence. That is why the phone call cut so deeply. It was not just news of death. It was a summons back into the world that had cast me aside, a reminder that no matter how far I had tried to move on, the past was not finished with me. The morning of the funeral was gray and heavy, the kind of day when even the sky seems unwilling to open itself. I stood in front of my small closet staring at my old red coat. It was too worn for such an occasion, its fabric thinned from years of winters, but it was all I had. I pulled it over my shoulders, smoothed the wrinkles from my black skirt, and told myself that dignity was not measured in fabric or price tags. It was measured in how you carried yourself. Riverside Chapel loomed large when I arrived, its white columns gleaming against the dreary sky. Cars far more expensive than mine lined the lot, sleek sedans and polished SUVs, each one a reminder of the world I no longer belonged to. I parked my aging Civic at the far edge where no one would notice, and walked slowly toward the doors. My steps echoed on the marble floor as I entered, heads turning in unison. I felt the weight of their eyes, pity from some, disdain from others. Whispers followed me like shadows. "She showed up," someone murmured. "Bold of her," another said. I slipped into a pew near the back, clutching a single white rose I had bought with the last of my grocery money. It was not grand, but it was honest. As the organ played and the casket was rolled down the aisle, my chest tightened. Charles lay within the man who had once been my beginning, and later my undoing. I whispered a prayer, not for him alone, but for myself, to survive what was coming. When the pastor invited family members to speak, Marcus was the first to rise. He strode confidently to the pulpit, his suit perfectly tailored, his voice carrying the same commanding timbre as his father's once had. "My father," he began, "was a man of vision, a man who built an empire from nothing. He taught me strength, ambition, and resilience." His words painted Charles as a hero larger than life, erasing the flaws, the betrayals, the nights of absence. But then Marcus's tone shifted sharp as a blade. He also knew who stood with him and who stood in his way. Not everyone supported his journey. Some people held him back, burdened him with small thinking and lack of vision. His eyes swept the room and landed squarely on me. A hush fell. He didn't need to say my name. The congregation understood. My hands tightened around the rose stem, the thorns biting into my skin. Gasps rippled through the chapel. An elderly cousin muttered, "Shameful," but others nodded in agreement. Marcus pressed on, his voice swelling with pride. "Dad overcame those obstacles. And because of that, everything he built, every contract, every success will live on through me. I will honor his legacy as he intended. Applause rose from one corner, though it was hesitant, awkward. I felt my cheeks burn. My son had used his father's funeral to humiliate me, to cast me as the anchor that once dragged Charles down. When the service ended, mourners approached the casket with flowers. I waited until most had left before I stepped forward. My hands trembled as I placed my single white rose atop the polished wood. "Goodbye, Charles," I whispered, my voice breaking. "For better or worse, you were part of me." As I turned to leave, Marcus's voice cut through the silence loud enough for those lingering to hear. "You don't belong here, Mom. This is not your place anymore." His words rang like a verdict, final and merciless. A few people gasped. Others looked away, unwilling to intervene. My heart cracked, but I refused to let him see me crumble. I lifted my chin, met his eyes, and walked slowly down the aisle, each step heavy with the weight of betrayal. Outside, the air was thick with humidity, but I drew in a deep breath, steadying myself. I told myself the same words I had whispered the night before. "Stand tall, Evelyn. Stand tall." The battle was not over. The funeral was only the prelude. The true reckoning would come in the lawyer's office, where Marcus believed he already held victory in his hands. He did not yet understand that the past has a way of rewriting itself, and that sometimes justice waits for the moment of greatest cruelty to make its entrance. The following week, the air in Atlanta carried the heavy scent of spring rain, the kind that lingers long after the storm has passed. I arrived at Howard Green's office a few minutes early, my red coat buttoned tight despite the warmth outside. The building was a towering structure of glass and steel, polished and intimidating, so different from the modest spaces I was used to. I hesitated at the revolving door, gathering my courage before stepping inside. The receptionist led me down a long hallway lined with framed certificates and photographs of Howard shaking hands with judges and governors. His reputation preceded him. He was a man who dealt in truth and finality. When I entered the conference room, the smell of mahogany and leather greeted me. A long table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs. Already the room was filling with relatives, cousins, uncles, distant family members, all dressed sharply, their whispers ceasing when they noticed me. Marcus sat at the head of the table as though he were already the heir apparent, his suit pristine, his tie knotted perfectly. He leaned back in his chair with practiced ease, a smirk playing at the edges of his lips. "You showed up," he said softly, just loud enough for me to hear. "Brave. Or foolish." I took a seat at the far end across from him. My hands trembled under the table, so I folded them in my lap, pressing them together until the shaking subsided. My heart pounded, but I reminded myself that I had survived worse. I had survived abandonment, humiliation, and years of being unseen. This was only another room, another battlefield. Howard Green entered moments later carrying a thick envelope. The room hushed instantly, the weight of anticipation palpable. He was a tall man with silver hair and steady eyes, his movements deliberate, his presence commanding without needing to raise his voice. He set the envelope on the table and adjusted his glasses, scanning the room slowly before speaking. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm but firm. "We are here to read the last will and testament of Charles Brooks. I ask for your respect and patience as we proceed." Murmurs quieted. Chairs creaked as everyone settled. Marcus crossed his arms, his smirk widening as though he already knew what was inside. He caught my eye and mouthed nothing, savoring the cruelty. I forced myself not to look away. My pulse throbbed in my ears, but I held his gaze. He thought this was his moment, his stage, his triumph. He thought the story was already written. Howard broke the seal on the envelope, sliding out several pages. The sound of paper against paper filled the silence like a drumbeat. He cleared his throat. "This document was signed, witnessed, and notarized in accordance with the law. Its contents reflect the final wishes of Charles Brooks." The tension thickened. I could feel the weight of every breath in the room. My stomach tightened, bracing for the inevitable. For years, I had told myself not to expect anything, not to hope. Yet here I was, hoping despite myself, praying for something more than nothing. Howard glanced at me briefly, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. Then he looked down at the pages, ready to begin. Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped together as if in prayer, though the smugness in his smile betrayed him. He was ready to claim everything to prove to the world and to me that I was irrelevant. But as Howard's lips parted to read the first line, I caught the faintest curve of amusement tugging at his mouth. It was the same flicker I had seen days before, when Marcus had humiliated me in front of the room. It was not the smile of a man who carried bad news. It was the smile of someone holding a truth that would shake the foundations of every smug certainty in the room. The storm had not yet broken, but I felt it coming. Howard Green lifted the first page of the will, his voice steady and deliberate, each syllable echoing across the conference room. I, Charles Brooks, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The words seemed to hang in the air, the official cadence of the law silencing even the softest whispers. I clasped my hands in my lap, my knuckles white. Marcus leaned forward smug, already certain the will would confirm his supremacy. He barely listened to the preamble. His eyes darted around the room, basking in the attention of the gathered relatives. To him, this was theater, and he was the star. Howard continued, "To my extended family, I leave modest bequests of personal property and small sums to be distributed equally." Murmurs rippled as cousins and uncles shifted in their seats. Names were read, items assigned, each detail methodical and impersonal. The tension built with every passing line, the anticipation for the larger reveal thickening like a storm cloud. "And to my son, Marcus Brooks." Howard read, his eyes lifting briefly toward Marcus before returning to the page. "I leave the Brooks family home provided that he maintains residence there for no less than 5 years and demonstrates stable employment. Should he fail to meet these conditions, ownership will revert to the estate." Marcus's smirk faltered for the briefest second before returning through tighter, more forced. He gave a small laugh as though the stipulation was beneath him. "Of course," he muttered. "That's expected." Howard flipped to the next page. "In addition to my son Marcus, I leave the sum of $500,000 contingent upon his completion of financial management training and his agreement to serve 3 consecutive years in an executive role within the company." This time, the murmurs grew louder. Marcus's jaw clenched, his hand gripping the table. $500,000 was a great sum, but compared to $34 million, it was crumbs. Worse, the conditions were clear: responsibility, discipline, humility. Traits Marcus had long abandoned. He forced a grin, glancing around the table. "Still a generous gift," he said, though his voice trembled at the edges. Howard paused, letting the silence stretch, then placed the page down carefully. He looked directly at me before speaking. My breath caught, and to my former wife, Evelyn Brooks, he said, "I leave the remainder of my estate totaling $34 million, as well as the controlling shares of Brooks Logistics Company. This decision is made with full acknowledgement of her sacrifices, loyalty, and integrity, qualities which I believe will honor and preserve the legacy I leave behind." The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few sharp exclamations of disbelief filled the air. My ears rang, my pulse surging so loudly I could barely hear the clamor. For a moment I sat frozen, unable to comprehend the words. 34 million, controlling shares, me. Marcus shot to his feet, his chair clattering against the floor. His face flushed crimson, his eyes wide with fury. "What? This is a mistake! He would never leave her that— Never!" His voice cracked with outrage, echoing off the paneled walls. Howard remained calm, his expression unyielding. "This is the signed, notarized will of Charles Brooks. It is valid and binding." Marcus slammed his fist against the table, rattling glasses of water. "She doesn't deserve it. She's nothing. She was nothing to him." His words sliced through me, but this time they did not wound. This time they revealed his desperation, his terror. I sat straighter, my trembling hands finally still. For years I had been invisible, dismissed, discarded. Now, in one moment, Charles's final act had placed me at the center, had forced recognition where none had existed. I could feel the power shift tangibly, the weight of judgment settling not on me, but on Marcus. Relatives who once looked through me now stared with wide eyes, their whispers carrying new tones: astonishment, respect, envy. The room had turned. Howard continued, his voice a steady drumbeat. "Charles Brooks stated explicitly that Evelyn Brooks is to serve as trustee for any remaining assets not yet allocated. She is to exercise discretion in preserving the estate and ensuring that the company continues to thrive. Marcus's hands shook as he pointed at me, spittle flying from his lips. This is her doing. She manipulated him, she tricked him in his final days. Howard raised a hand. Mr. Brooks, your accusations have no merit. The will was drafted months before his passing with witnesses present. Your father's wishes are clear. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. Marcus stood chest heaving, his eyes blazing with hatred. He looked around the room, searching for allies, but found only lowered gazes and uncomfortable silence. Even those who had once aligned with him shrank from his fury, unwilling to challenge the authority of the document in Howard's hands. I felt a strange calm settle over me, as though the storm I had braced for all my life had finally broken and I had survived it. I inhaled deeply, the air sharp and cleansing. Marcus could rage, he could scream, but the truth had been written, signed, and sealed. For once, I did not need to fight. Justice had spoken for me. Howard placed the final page on the table and looked around the room. That concludes the reading of the will. Any challenges may be addressed through the court, but I assure you this document has been examined thoroughly. Charles Brooks's intentions are undeniable. Marcus's voice cracked raw and furious. "This isn't over!" he shouted, pointing at me again. "You think you've won, Mom? You'll regret this." But even as he spoke, I saw the cracks in his armor. The smug certainty had shattered, leaving only a desperate, entitled man-child exposed before the family he had tried to impress. I folded my hands neatly on the table, my voice steady for the first time. "I didn't take anything from you, Marcus. Your father gave me what he believed I deserved. Maybe one day you'll understand why." The room fell silent again, the weight of truth heavy in the air. Marcus sank back into his chair, his fury boiling but powerless against the ink and signatures that had rewritten the story he thought was his. Howard Green set aside the last page of the will and lifted a separate envelope, smaller, its edges worn, as though it had been handled many times. His tone softened. Charles Brooks left a personal letter to accompany his will. He instructed that it be read aloud in this room in the presence of his family. The air shifted. Chairs creaked, breaths caught the storm outside, silenced by the anticipation within. Marcus stiffened, glaring at the envelope as though he could burn it with his rage alone. Howard unfolded the paper slowly, his glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, and then began to read. "My dear Evelyn," he started, his voice gentle. "If these words are being spoken, then I am gone. I imagine the room is heavy, perhaps tense, and that old wounds have come to the surface once more. Before anything else, let me say this: I was not always the man I should have been to you. My ambition blinded me. I mistook success for worth, and in doing so, I forgot the value of the woman who stood beside me when I had nothing." My chest tightened. The room blurred as tears welled in my eyes. For years, I had wondered if Charles ever truly understood what I had given, what I had sacrificed. Now, from beyond the grave, his words pierced through the silence of decades. Howard's voice steadied as he continued. "I remember the nights you stayed awake balancing ledgers when I was too tired to think straight. I remember the mornings you packed my lunches while you rushed to your second job. I remember the red coat you wore in winter, thin and fraying because we could not afford another, and yet you never complained. Evelyn, I remember everything, and though I buried those memories under layers of pride and arrogance, they never left me. I owe my empire to you, and I failed to honor that truth while I lived." A murmur rippled across the room. Some relatives shifted uncomfortably, others glanced at me with new eyes. Marcus scoffed loudly, his jaw clenched, but Howard ignored him and read on. "To my son Marcus," the letter continued, the words weighted now sharper. "You are my pride and my sorrow. You inherited my ambition, my drive, and my hunger for more. But you also inherited my blindness. You have looked down on your mother, dismissing her as unworthy because you saw in her what I once feared in myself: humility, restraint, sacrifice. These are not weaknesses, my son. They are strengths greater than wealth." Marcus slammed his fist against the table, but Howard did not pause. The authority of the words pressed on unstoppable. "I gave you everything you asked for," Marcus, the letter declared. "I gave you schools, suits, cars, and access to a world many will never know. But I failed to teach you gratitude. I failed to teach you that wealth without humility becomes poison. You believed you were entitled to all I built simply because you carried my name. But a legacy is not inherited, it is earned. And you have not earned it, not yet. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus's face twisted red with fury and shame, but he said nothing. His eyes darted to the floor, then back at Howard, then to me, desperate for some way to undo the words now echoing through the room. Howard steadied the page in his hand and read the final portion. That is why Marcus Y chose differently. I leave the greater share of my estate and control of my company to your mother, Evelyn. She has demonstrated the strength, loyalty, and resilience necessary to preserve it. This is not to punish you, though I know it feels that way. It is to give you a lesson you must learn if you are to carry this name with honor. Watch her. Learn from her. Understand what true wealth looks like. Until then, the empire remains in her hands. My breath caught as Howard's eyes lifted briefly toward me before returning to the page. And to you, Evelyn. The letter closed. I offer what little I can at this late hour, my acknowledgement. You deserved it long ago. I know my apology comes too late to heal every wound, but I pray that my recognition grants you some measure of peace. You were never nothing. You were everything, and though I did not say it often enough, I loved you. This I hope will prove it. Howard folded the letter slowly, the sound of the paper soft but thunderous in the silence. He placed it back in the envelope, his eyes lingering on me for a moment before resting it gently on the table. I sat frozen, my pulse pounding in my ears. The words wrapped around me like a balm, searing and soothing all at once. For so long I had carried the weight of invisibility, the ache of being dismissed. Now, finally, I was seen. Not in whispers, not in pity, but in words carved into permanence. Across the table, Marcus seethed. His fists were tight, his shoulders rigid, his eyes wild. "This is manipulation," he spat. "She poisoned him against me. This letter, it's a lie." But his voice cracked, betraying him. No one in the room believed his fury. They had all heard the truth, and once spoken truth cannot be undone. Relatives who once smirked at me now looked at me differently, some with shame, others with respect. Even those who had once written me off seemed to shift uncomfortably in their seats as though realizing they had been complicit in my erasure. I felt Loretta's words echo in my heart: justice comes, even if it's late. I breathed deeply, my shoulders loosening for the first time in years. Charles had left me wealth, yes, but more than that, he had left me recognition. He had left me dignity, and dignity was worth more than any dollar. Howard cleared his throat. "That concludes the reading of the letter." He set the pages down carefully, then leaned back, his expression calm but firm. The room buzzed faintly, but no one spoke. The weight of Charles's words hung too heavy, undeniable, final. For the first time in a long time, I did not feel small. I did not feel invisible. I sat straighter, my red coat warm around my shoulders, and I knew that this moment, this truth, would never be taken from me again. The letter ended, but its echo lingered in the air like the toll of a church bell. For a moment, no one moved. Then chairs shifted, throats cleared, and the room filled with whispers, half awe, half unease. I remained still, my hands folded neatly on the table as though the storm had finally passed and I was sitting in its quiet eye. Marcus, however, could not contain himself. He leapt to his feet, his voice ragged with fury. "This is outrageous! That letter is nothing but sentiment. The company should be mine. The money should be mine. Everyone knows it." His words trembled, desperation dripping from every syllable. He turned to Howard Green, pointing an accusatory finger. "I'll contest this. I'll drag it into court. You'll all see. She doesn't deserve a dime." Howard's expression remained unshaken. "You are free to pursue litigation, Mr. Brooks," he said, his tone even. "But I assure you this will is airtight. It was signed months ago, witnessed and notarized properly. Your father's intentions are clear." Marcus's eyes darted around the room, searching for support. Yet all he met were lowered gazes, uneasy glances, relatives shifting in their chairs to avoid his fury. The allies he once relied on had melted into silence. Alone, his rage looked pitiful, a tantrum against an immovable wall. I rose slowly, my red coat falling into place around my shoulders like armor. My voice calm and steady carried across the room. "Marcus, your father left you lessons, not punishment. If you cannot see that, then perhaps you will in time. But this moment, it is not about you alone. It is about the truth finally being spoken. The room hushed. Marcus froze, his jaw tightening, his fists clenched, but he did not answer. He could not. The days that followed blurred into a battle Marcus insisted on fighting. True to his word, he filed challenges accusing me of manipulation, of coercion, of deceit. But each claim crumbled under the weight of the notarized documents and the testimony of witnesses who confirmed Charles's sound mind. Courtrooms replaced conference rooms, but every verdict landed the same: the will stood, the company and estate were mine. With every failed motion, Marcus's reputation cracked. Business partners distanced themselves. Newspapers reported his tantrums, and whispers of entitlement replaced the praise he once demanded. By the end of the year, he was no longer a promising heir, but a cautionary tale, a man undone by arrogance. As for me, I did not revel in the downfall of my son. The victory was not sweet, it was sobering. Wealth had never been my pursuit, nor was power. What mattered was dignity long denied, finally restored. I made a choice with the estate. A portion went to secure my future, yes, but the greater part became a legacy of service. I established the Brooks Foundation, a scholarship program for children from struggling families in Atlanta, especially those overlooked or dismissed the way I had once been. Each time I signed an award letter for a young student, I thought of the sacrifices I had made, the invisibility I endured, and how those hardships could now transform into opportunities for someone else. The company, too, became more than a monument to Charles's ambition. I ensured its leadership reflected the values he had ignored: integrity, fairness, humility. The business thrived not through ruthless expansion, but through steady growth grounded in respect for the people who worked there. One afternoon, as I stood outside the community library where I still volunteered, Loretta Johnson joined me, her cane tapping softly against the pavement. She looked at me with a smile both proud and tender. "I told you, Evelyn," she said. "Justice comes even if it's late." I adjusted my red coat against the breeze, the same coat that had carried me through winters of scarcity, the same coat that now cloaked me in triumph. "It did, Loretta," I replied quietly. "And not just for me, for every woman who has ever been told she is nothing." The setting sun bathed the library in golden light, children's laughter spilling out from the entrance as families arrived for evening programs. I watched them, my heart swelling with something far greater than victory peace. Because in the end, inheritance was never about money. It was about recognition. It was about sacrifice, finally seen dignity, finally restored justice, finally claimed. And as I stood there watching life continue with all its noise and wonder, I whispered the words Charles had left me, the words that had rewritten my story. "You were never nothing. You were everything."